The morning it happened started like any other morning for Rex, which meant he was already awake before sunrise, already running through his mental checklist the way he had done every single day for the past 11 years, checking the perimeter sensors on his monitors, reviewing his water filtration readings, logging his caloric inventory in the worn green notebook he kept on the shelf above his cot, never once thinking that today would be the day all of it actually mattered, never once letting himself fully believe that the thing he had prepared for his entire adult life was actually going to arrive on a random Tuesday in October, while the rest of the world was pouring coffee and sitting in traffic and sending emails about quarterly reports. Because even Rex, who believed harder than almost anyone that the world was fragile and temporary, and one bad day away from ending, had a small, quiet voice somewhere in the back of his mind that wondered if he was wrong, if the bunker and the stockpiles and the years of sacrifice had all been an elaborate response to fear that would never actually materialize, a fear born from too much reading and too much time alone and not enough trust in the basic stability of the world. And he had spent years fighting that voice down whenever it surfaced, filling it with more data, more preparation, more reinforcement of the walls, both literal and psychological, that he had built around himself and his supplies and his carefully ordered life underground. And then at 7:42 in the morning, his sensors spiked in a way they had never spiked before, and the ground began to move, and that small, quiet voice went permanently and completely silent. And Rex felt something he had not expected to feel in that moment, which was not relief or vindication, but a deep and hollow grief for every person above ground who had never believed it was coming. Rex was 44 years old, lived on 40 acres in rural eastern Tennessee, and had not told a single living person precise coordinates of his bunker, not his brother, not the two friends he still occasionally talked on the radio, not anyone. Because Rex had understood from the very beginning that in a true collapse scenario, the most dangerous thing in the world would not be radiation or starvation or contaminated water, but other people, desperate and unprepared and willing to take whatever they needed from whoever had it. And so his entire survival philosophy had been built around one foundational principle, which was that nobody could take what they did not know existed. And that principle had cost him 2 relationships and more holidays alone than he cared to count. But standing in his bunker at 7:43 in the morning, while the earth shook like something enormous and ancient was turning over in its sleep, Rex felt nothing close to regret. 312 miles northwest of Rex, in a converted storm shelter beneath the property outside of Bowling Green, Kentucky, Grady was doing push-ups, which was what Grady did every morning at 0600, without exception, because Grady believed that physical discipline was the foundation of every other kind of discipline, and that a man who let his body go soft in a bunker would let everything else go soft too. And Grady had spent 22 years in the Army before a knee injury ended his service, and those 22 years had settled into his bones in a way that never fully left. So even alone underground with no unit to command and no mission to execute, he kept the schedule, kept the physical training, kept the logbooks and the equipment checks and the rotating watch rotations. He ran alone by setting alarms at 4-hour intervals through the night, because Grady knew that chaos found the undisciplined first, and he had no intention of being found by anything. And when the impact hit and his shelter groaned and the lights flickered and his carefully organized shelving rattled hard enough to knock a water container to the floor, Grady's first instinct was not fear but assessment, dropping to one knee, checking his watch, noting the time, reaching for his radio, scanning frequencies for any military or emergency broadcast signal, finding nothing but static and screaming and making his first log entry of what he was already thinking of as day 1. June was crying when it happened, which was not something she would have predicted about herself, because June was not generally a crier and had always prided herself on being steady in crisis. But she had been awake since 5 in the morning, tending to her underground growing beds and listening to the emergency broadcast that had been running for about 19 minutes on her backup radio. A broadcast that was saying something had been detected, that impact projections were being revised, that people in affected areas should seek shelter immediately, And June had stood in her grow room surrounded by the softness of her UV lights and the smell of soil and basil, and she had thought about her sister in Portland, who had laughed the hardest at the bunker, who had sent June a meme once about the end of the world with a caption that said, "Call me when it actually happens." And June had pulled out her phone, even though she knew the cell towers were already overwhelmed, and she had tried to call her sister anyway, because that is what you do. And when the line didn't connect, she had started crying quietly to herself among her tomato plants. And she was still crying when the impact arrived and the ceiling of her bunker cracked in 2 places, and the lights went out for 11 seconds before the backup generator kicked on, and June stood in the sudden darkness with dirt on her hands and the weight of understanding settling over her like something she could not put down. Owen did not cry. Owen opened his laptop, pulled up the tracking data he had been monitoring for the past 72 hours, and began documenting. Owen was a geologist by training and a prepper by what he called logical conclusion, meaning that once he had spent enough time studying large-scale geological and atmospheric events, he had arrived, without any particular drama, at the conclusion that the probability of a civilization-altering event within his lifetime was high enough to warrant serious preparation, and so he had prepared seriously, which for Owen meant data, meant redundant measurement systems, meant air quality sensors and radiation counters and seismographs and a meticulous logging system that would allow him to reconstruct exactly what happened and when and with what force. Because Owen believed that the most dangerous thing in any crisis was not the crisis itself, but the absence of accurate information. And as his bunker walls shook and his instruments spiked and the numbers on his screen told a story that was worse than even his modeling had suggested, Owen typed steadily and carefully and told himself that whatever came next, he would understand it better than anyone, and understand was the only real form of control that had ever meant anything to him. Walt was on the radio when the world ended, which meant Walt was doing what Walt was almost always doing, sitting in the cramped back room of his underground shelter outside in Knoxville with his headphones on and his logbook open, scanning frequencies the way another man might flip through television channels, listening to the loose and formal network of ham operators he had been part of for over 20 years. And in the weeks leading up to the impact, there had been more traffic than usual, more chatter about the asteroid, more people who had dismissed it entirely, and more people who were quietly terrified. And Walt had listened to all of it without saying much because Walt was a listener by nature, a man who had learned early that you collected more useful information with your mouth closed. And on the morning of the impact, he had been listening to a man named Pete somewhere in Western Virginia, who was saying he didn't think it was going to be that bad, that the projections were being overblown, that the government would have warned people if it was truly catastrophic. And Walt had been about to respond when the signal dissolved into a burst of static and noise that was unlike anything Walt had ever heard on any frequency in 40 years of operating, a sound like the radio itself was screaming. And then Pete's signal was gone, and Walt sat very still in his chair with his headphones on while the bunker shook around him, and he thought about Pete in Western Virginia and the way the man had said it wasn't going to be that bad. And Walt reached for his logbook and wrote the time, and then sat quietly for a long moment before writing the words "first casualties," ? Because he did not know for certain, but he suspected. And Walt was almost always right about the things he suspected. Milo was the last of them to make it underground, having spent the final 40 minutes before impact in a truck on a county road outside of Chattanooga, trying to reach his storage unit, where he kept a secondary supply cache. Because Milo was a man who always wanted one more thing, one more layer of preparation, one more asset accounted for, which was both his greatest strength as a prepper and his most persistent flaw. And he had been listening to the emergency broadcast on his truck radio and telling himself he had just enough time when the sky to the northeast went white in a way that had no business being white at that hour of the morning. And Milo had stopped the truck in the middle of the road and looked at that white sky for exactly 3 seconds before he turned the truck around and drove back toward his property faster than he had ever driven anything in his life, running through the inventory in his head the whole way, calculating what he had and what he was leaving behind. and what the deficit would cost him over the next 12 months. Because even in that moment with the sky doing something impossible behind him, Milo's brain was running the numbers, and he made it to his bunker entrance with what he would later calculate had been approximately 4 minutes to spare. Pulling the hatch closed above him and sitting on the stairs in the dark while the world above came apart. And in that darkness, with the sound of something catastrophic happening just a few feet of steel and concrete above his head, Milo did something that surprised even him, which was that he sat completely still and did not think about inventory or trade value or supply deficits at all, but instead thought about his father, who had been a junk dealer in rural Georgia and who had taught Milo from the time he was small that everything had a value if you understood what was worth the right person at the right time. And his father had meant his practical business advice, but Milo had taken it further, had built an entire philosophy around it, had come to believe that exchange and trade were not just economic activities, but fundamentally human ones, the thing that had separated early humans from isolated animals, the behavior that had made civilization possible in the first place. And sitting on those stairs in the dark with the world ending above him, Milo thought that if anyone was going to be left to rebuild something when all of this was over, they were going to need someone who understood value and exchange and the delicate mechanics of getting people with different things to agree on fair terms. And Milo sat a little straighter in the dark and thought that maybe being the man who put a price on everything was not going to be a liability, but the most useful thing he had to offer. And then he reached for his lantern and his logbook and began writing down everything he had, because already his mind was calculating what would be worth to the right person when all this was over. The first week underground after the impact was the worst week of Rex's life, and Rex had survived some genuinely terrible weeks, including the winter he spent in a tent in the Smoky Mountains after losing his apartment, and the 3 years he spent working a job he hated in a city he despised before finally buying his Tennessee acreage and committing fully to the life he had always known he was supposed to live. But none of that compared to particular quality of silence that filled his bunker in the days after the impact, a silence that was not peaceful or restful but dense and pressurized, like the air itself was aware of what had happened above and was holding its breath. And Rex moved through that silence methodically, checking his systems, logging his inventory, testing his air filtration readings every 6 hours, eating precisely the portions he had calculated for an 18-month underground stay, sleeping in 4-hour intervals, keeping his body and his mind on A schedule, because Rex understood that routine was the thing standing between a person and the psychological collapse that could take down a survivor just as effectively as any physical threat. And he had read enough accounts of long-term isolation to know that the mind needed structure the way the body needed calories. And so he gave his mind structure, gave it tasks and timelines and checklists, filled every hour with purpose, and left no empty space for the kind of thinking that didn't lead anywhere useful, and never once turning on his ham radio. Because Rex had made a decision before the first day was out that radio silence was the safest posture for an unknown threat environment, and he was sticking to it regardless of what he might be missing, regardless of the small persistent part of him that wanted to know if anyone else had made it. And so Rex lived in his silence and worked his checklist and told himself that information could wait and that discipline now would mean survival later. Grady had his radio on within the first hour, not to broadcast, because Grady understood operational security as well as anyone, but to listen, because intelligence was everything, and a man who didn't know his environment was a man already half defeated. And what Grady heard on the frequencies in those first hours and days was a picture of catastrophic loss that even his military background had not fully prepared him for. Voices cutting in and out, some panicked, some eerily calm, coordinates given and then gone silent. A woman somewhere in Ohio who broadcast for 3 days straight before her signals simply stopped. A man who identified himself as a National Guard sergeant who said he was the only one left from his unit and was looking for command authority and found none. And Grady logged all of it with the same careful hand he had used for over 22 years of military service, building a picture of the post-impact world one data point at a time, And what the picture showed was not a situation waiting for government, restoration, or military reorganization, but a genuine civilizational collapse, the kind that Grady had privately believed was possible but had never fully allowed himself to expect. And the understanding settled into him not as panic, but as a shift in operational framework, because the mission had changed and Grady was a man who adapted to mission changes. And the new mission, as he wrote in his logbook on day 4, was this: establish order, find capable people, build structure, and do not let the chaos win. Because Grady had seen what happened when structure collapsed in the field, and he had seen what happened when someone stepped into that vacuum with a clear head and a clear plan, and he intended to be that person, intended to be the one who showed up to whatever was left of this world with a framework already built and conviction to hold it together through the inevitable resistance of people who confused discipline with control and mistook order for oppression. And he was already thinking about what that framework needed to look like, what rules were non-negotiable and what was flexible, what a fair system of contribution and accountability looked like among a small group of survivors. Because Grady knew from experience that the hardest part of leading people was not the logistics, but the buy-in, getting people who had only answered to themselves to accept that some things had to be decided collectively and enforced consistently. And he was not naive enough to think it would be easy, but he was experienced enough to know it was necessary. June stopped crying by the 3rd day, which she considered a reasonable timeline given the circumstances, and replaced the crying with work, because work was what June did when the world became too large and too painful to hold in her mind all at once, and there was plenty of work to do in a functioning underground growing operation. The UV lights needed their daily calibration. The growing beds needed monitoring for moisture and nutrient levels. The seed inventory needed rotating and cataloging. The composting system needed tending. And June moved through all with the focused energy of someone who understood that the plants did not care about asteroids or grief or the sister she could not reach. The plants just needed what they needed and would either thrive or die based on whether those needs were met. And there was something clarifying about that simplicity, something that helped June organize her own thinking during those long underground days. And what she kept coming back to as she worked was that food was going to be the first real crisis for every survivor above ground eventually, because you could stockpile calories, but eventually stockpiles ran out, and the only real answer to that problem was production, was soil and seed and water and patience. And June had all those things and the knowledge to use them. And she found that the more she focused on that fact, the smaller her grief became. Not gone, but compressed into something she could carry while still moving forward. Owen had filled 14 pages of data logs by the end of day 3 and was already beginning to model recovery timelines. Working from the seismic readings he had captured during impact, the atmospheric pressure changes his sensors had recorded, and the radiation baseline readings he was taking every 4 hours, cross-referencing everything against the geological and atmospheric research he had loaded onto his hardened laptop in the months before impact, when the asteroid trajectory had first been identified as a genuine concern by the small community of amateur astronomers and independent researchers who had been tracking it while official channels remained publicly cautious. And what Owen's data was telling him was not good. The impact had been larger than the last public estimates had suggested. The dust and debris in the upper atmosphere was going to be significant and long-lasting. Surface temperatures were going to drop, and stay dropped for a period he was currently estimating at between 14 and 22 months. And crop production above ground was going to be essentially impossible for at least the first year, which meant that any survivor community that was not already growing food underground or had not stockpiled calories for a minimum of 18 months was going to face serious starvation risk well before any meaningful surface agriculture was possible. And Owen wrote all of this down in his precise, careful handwriting, and then sat with the numbers for a long time, because the numbers were saying something that went beyond data and into something more personal, which was that the survivors who made it to the next 2 years were not going to be the ones who were simply tough or well-armed or determined, but the ones who had prepared specifically and intelligently, and more importantly, the ones who were willing to combine what they had rather than protected in isolation. And that second condition was the one that kept Owen staring at his logbook long after he should have been asleep. It was Walt who first understood that a network was forming whether anyone wanted it or not, because Walt had been on frequencies every day since the impact and had watched it happen organically the way he had watched communities form on the radio before, slowly and cautiously, and driven by the simple human need to know that someone else was out there. And by the end of the second week, there were maybe a dozen regular voices on the frequencies he monitored, people who had found each other through the static and started checking in daily, sharing air quality observations and surface condition reports, and the kind of careful, non-specific information that people share when they want a connection, but were not yet ready for full disclosure. And Walt listened to all of them and said little, building his mental map of who was out there and where they approximately were and what kind of people they seemed to be. And he noted the prepper in eastern Tennessee who never transmitted but whose antenna he could sometimes detect passively on certain frequencies, a ghost presence that Walt filed away without comment. And he noted the military voice out of Kentucky who transmitted in precise structured reports that had the rhythm of official communication, even with no official structure left to report to. And he noted the woman who sometimes sang quietly between transmissions as if she had forgotten she was broadcasting. And Walt thought that whoever these people were, whatever their individual situations, they were going to need each other eventually. And the question was not whether that would happen, but how badly things would have to get before the ones who were resisting it finally let themselves admit it. Milo had been busy, while the others were grieving or drilling or logging data. Milo had spent the first 2 weeks doing what he did best, which was taking inventory of everything he had and building a comprehensive picture of his assets. Not just the food and water and medical supplies and tools that form the backbone of any serious prepper stockpile, but the secondary and tertiary items that most preppers undervalued. The hand tools and the seeds and the books on practical skills and the spare parts for equipment that would eventually break, and the comfort items that people dismissed as luxuries until morale collapsed and suddenly a bar of real soap or a bottle of decent whiskey became more valuable than almost anything else. And Milo had all of these things in carefully organized quantities because Milo had spent years thinking not just about what he would need to survive, but about what other people would need and therefore what they would trade for. And as he worked through his inventory in those first quiet weeks, he was already sketching out in his mind the rough outlines of a trade system, thinking about what a fair exchange looked like in a world where currency was meaningless and value had to be negotiated from scratch. And he was thinking about how you built trust with strangers when there was no institutional framework to enforce agreements. And the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that the answer was reputation, that in a small enough community of survivors, reputation was the only currency that mattered, and Milo had every intention of building his very carefully from the very first interaction he had, which he knew was coming, because no one stayed isolated forever, not even the ghost on the eastern Tennessee frequencies who never transmitted, but was definitely out there listening, definitely still alive, and definitely, Milo suspected, going to have to make a choice sooner or later about whether silence was still serving him. Rex opened his hatch on day 47, which was later than his original plan had called for, but earlier than his most conservative model had suggested was safe, and he had arrived at day 47 through a process that was equal parts data and instinct. His air quality sensors showing particulate levels that were still elevated but trending downward, his radiation reading stable and within acceptable range for limited surface exposure, and a gut feeling that he could not quantify, but had learned over years of living by his own judgment to take seriously. And he cracked the hatch just 2 inches at first and held it there for a full 10 minutes, breathing slowly through his filtered respirator and listening to the quality of the air and the quality of the silence above him before opening it further. And when he finally pulled himself up to the hatch and stood on the surface of his Tennessee property for the first time in 47 days, he stood very still for a long moment and just looked, because nothing he prepared himself to see had fully prepared him for what was actually there, which was a landscape that was recognizable in its basic geography, but stripped of every quality that had made it feel alive. The trees, still standing but ashen and bare. The sky a flat, colorless white that gave no indication of where the sun was. The air tasting of something mineral and foreign. And the silence, the most complete silence Rex had ever experienced in his life. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through leaves, nothing, just a stillness so absolute it felt less like quiet and more like the world was simply holding what it had always been holding and had finally stopped pretending otherwise. And Rex stood in that. Silence for a long time before he went back underground and wrote in his logbook that the surface was survivable with respiratory protection for limited periods, and that long-term exposure remained inadvisable until particulate levels dropped further. And then he sat on his cot and stared at the wall for a while before making himself eat dinner and run his evening checklists, because discipline was the point, and the point had not changed just because the world above looked like something from A. Dream he didn't want to be having. Grady surfaced on day 38, which he considered a reasonable balance between caution and operational necessity, and he came up armed, which he also considered reasonable, with his rifle slung and his sidearm holstered, and his eyes moving the way they had moved on patrol in places that wanted to hurt him. And he spent his first 2 hours on the surface doing a methodical perimeter assessment of the area around his shelter entrance, not because he expected immediate threats, but because establishing a baseline was the first step in understanding any environment, and Grady did not skip steps. And what his assessment showed was a landscape of extraordinary destruction that was also, in its own way, extraordinarily quiet. The farmland around his property flattened and gray. The distant tree line reduced to broken silhouettes against that strange pale sky, and not a single sign of another living person anywhere in his line of sight, which was simultaneously the relief and a problem, because Grady's plan had always involved finding people, the right kind of people, capable and disciplined people who understood that survival was a collective project, whether you liked it or not. And a landscape this empty suggested that the pool of candidates was going to be smaller than he had hoped, and Grady noted this in his log, and then set up his portable antenna on the surface, and spent an hour on the radio scanning frequencies, before going back underground. And what he heard on those frequencies was enough to confirm that there were survivors out there, scattered and cautious, and communicating the careful, abbreviated way of people who were not yet sure who was listening. And Grady began building his contact list, because the mission required it, and the mission was a thing. June surfaced on day 52, later than Owen's data had suggested was necessary, but earlier than her own anxiety had wanted. And she brought her soil testing kit with her, which everyone who knew her would have found entirely predictable, and she spent her first hour above ground not looking at the devastation around her, but crouching in what had been her kitchen garden, and pressing test strips into the ash-covered earth with the focused attention of someone performing a medical examination, checking pH and nitrogen and mineral composition and moisture content. And the results were not good, but they were not as bad as her worst projections had feared. The soil was not dead. It was shocked and depleted and covered in a layer of impact debris that would need to be worked and amended before it could support anything. But the underlying structure was there. The microbial life was diminished, but not entirely gone. And June sat back on her heels in the gray light and felt something that she carefully identified as cautious hope rather than optimism, because optimism was what you felt before you had data, and hope was what you felt when the data was bad, but not unsurvivable. And she was working with hope now, which felt like enough to stand on, and she spent another hour walking the perimeter of her property with her testing kit, working the ground in a systematic grid pattern the way she had learned from the agriculture extension books. She had spent years collecting, checking, for variation in soil condition across different exposures and elevations, looking for the patches that had retained the most moisture and the most biological activity beneath the ash layer, mapping them in her notebook with the same care she had given her underground growing beds. Because June understood that the surface was going to come back eventually, and when it did, she intended to be ready with a plan that was already tested and refined rather than starting from scratch. And she took her samples back underground and began planning what an 18-month soil rehabilitation program would look like and what she would need from other survivors to make it work, because she already knew she could not do it alone and had made a private peace with that fact somewhere around day 30, when she had stopped pretending that self-sufficiency and isolation were the same thing. Owen had been tracking Walt's radio network passively for 3 weeks before he finally transmitted, and when he did, he was brief and precise, giving his general region, his professional background, and the headline figures from his atmospheric data, because Owen believed that the best introduction you could give in a post-collapse environment was a demonstration of what you had that other people needed. And what Owen had was numbers, and numbers were what everyone was operating without and desperately required. And the response from the network was immediate and hungry. People asking questions he could answer, and questions he couldn't, and some questions that told him more about the asker situation than any direct inquiry would have. And Owen answered what he could, and logged what he couldn't, and began to build a picture not just of the physical recovery timeline, but of the human landscape he was going to have to navigate, which was complicated and contradictory, and full of people with strong opinions about everything and data supporting almost none of it. And Owen found this professionally frustrating and personally unsurprising, and made a note in his logbook that the social dynamics of the survivor network were going to require as much careful management as the atmospheric data if anything useful was going to come out of the next 12 months. And he also noted, with the same neutral precision he applied to everything, that he was not naturally suited to social management, that his instinct was always to present the data and expect people to respond rationally to it, and that this instinct had failed him repeatedly in his career, and would likely fail him again out here, and that he needed to find someone in this network who was better at the human part than he was, and trust him to handle it while he focused on what he was actually good at, which was understanding exactly how bad things were and how long it was going to take before they got better. And he circled that note twice and put a star next to it because it felt important in a way that was hard to quantify, but that he had learned over the years to take seriously when it showed up. Walt had suggested the meeting point 6 weeks after the impact, a specific crossroads location he had identified from topographic maps as being roughly central to the approximate positions of the 5 other survivors he had been most consistently in contact with, and he had suggested it carefully and without pressure, framing it as an option rather than a plan, because Walt understood that you did not push people toward things they were not ready for. You made the option available and let them come to it in their own time, and the response had been what he expected, which was mixed. Grady immediately confirmed and offered to arrive early and establish perimeter. Milo confirmed and asked what the trade situation would look like. June confirmed and said she was bringing soil samples. Owen confirmed with a list of conditions about respiratory protection and proximity protocols. And Rex said nothing at all, which Walt had also expected. And Walt noted Rex's silence without judgment and transmitted the coordinates anyway, directed to everyone, including the frequency he suspected Rex was monitoring without responding to, because Walt believed in giving people the information they needed to make their own choices and leaving the choice genuinely open. And if Rex showed up, that was his choice. And if he didn't, that was also his choice, and Walt respected both outcomes equally. Or told himself he did, though he had been thinking about Rex for weeks now, thinking about what it meant to be that committed to silence in a world where silence was no longer just a preference but a genuine risk, and wondering what it was going to take to reach a person who had built their entire survival strategy around the principle of not being reached. Milo arrived at the crossroads first, which surprised him because he had not thought of himself as an early arrival kind of person, but he had found himself moving faster than planned once he was above ground, partly because the landscape was disorienting in a way that made forward momentum feel safer than stillness, and partly because Milo was genuinely curious about these people he had been hearing on the radio for weeks, Curious in a way he was always curious about potential trading partners, assessing and calculating before the first word was exchanged. And he set up a small folding table near the crossroads marker and laid out a selection of trade items he had brought as conversation starters, nothing irreplaceable, nothing that revealed the full depth of his stockpile, just enough to establish the fact of his resources and signal his intentions. And he stood behind his table in the gray afternoon light and waited, and the first person to arrive after him was Grady, who looked at the table and then looked at Milo with an expression that was not quite hostile, but was definitely evaluating. And Milo smiled and said he had brought coffee, real coffee, ground and vacuum sealed, and watched Grady's expression shift in the small involuntary way that people's expressions shifted when they wanted something and were trying not to show it. And Milo thought that was a fine place to start. The meeting at the crossroads lasted 4 hours and accomplished almost nothing, which Walt had privately predicted, and which did nothing to make the experience less exhausting, because knowing a thing's going to go badly and then watching it go badly are two entirely different experiences. And Walt had spent those 4 hours doing what he always did, which was listening more than talking, and watching the dynamics between people who had only known each other as voices on a radio and were now standing 3 feet apart in the ash-gray afternoon light, having to reckon with the physical reality of each other. And what he observed was not encouraging in the short term, but not without promise in the longer view, because the conflict that erupted within the first 20 minutes was at least honest conflict, real disagreement between people who had genuine convictions and were not pretending otherwise. And Walt had learned over decades of bringing people together on the radio that honest conflict, as uncomfortable as it was to sit inside of, was actually a better starting point than false harmony, because false harmony was fragile in a way that honest conflict was not, because false harmony always collapsed eventually, and when it did, it was harder to rebuild than something that had started with open friction and survived it. And Walt told himself that as he stood at the edge of the group and watched Grady and Rex face each other for the first time. Grady had opened the meeting the way Grady opened everything, with a proposal for structure, standing at the center of the crossroads with his hands clasped behind his back and his voice carrying particular authority of someone who had spent 2 decades being listened to, and his proposal was straightforward enough on its surface: a rotating watch schedule, a shared communication protocol, a basic set of rules about resource disclosure and mutual defense, all of it presented as self-evident. Common sense by a man who clearly believed it was self-evident common sense and was quietly baffled that anyone could see it differently. And he had laid it out with the crisp efficiency of a briefing, hitting each point in sequence, anticipating objections and addressing them before they were raised. And there was something both impressive and slightly suffocating about the presentation. The sense of a man who had thought so hard about the right answer that he had forgotten to leave room for anyone else's version of right. And the first person pushed back was Rex, which surprised everyone except Walt, because Rex had shown up after all, had appeared at the edge of the crossroads about 40 minutes into the gathering, standing at a distance that was technically within earshot, but communicated very clearly that he was here on his own terms and would leave on his own terms, and nobody should read his presence as agreement to anything. And Rex had listened to Grady's proposal with an expression that was impossible to read, and then said, in a voice that was flat and unhurried and somehow more forceful for being quiet, that he had not spent 11 years building an independent survival operation in order to hand his location and his resource inventory to a committee, and that any system that required him to disclose what he had and where he was to people he had known for less than an hour was not a system designed for mutual benefit, but a system designed to make him a target. And the silence that followed that statement was a kind of silence that meant everyone present was recalibrating something. Grady's response was immediate and controlled, and only slightly too controlled. The way a person sounds when they're choosing their words carefully because their first instinct was to say something sharper. And he said that he understood the concern, but that a group without shared information was not a group, but just a collection of individuals standing near each other, and that if they were not willing to function as a group, then there was no point in any of them being here. And he looked at Rex when he said it in a way that made clear he was not asking a rhetorical question. And Rex looked back at him with the steady, unbothered patience of someone who had made peace long ago with being the person in a room that nobody quite knew what to do with, and said that he had come here to listen, not to join anything, and that those were two different things. And Grady opened his mouth and closed it again, and Milo stepped smoothly into the gap the way Milo had been stepping into gaps his entire professional life, saying that maybe they were getting ahead of themselves, that the question of formal structure could wait, and maybe they should start with something smaller, with what each person had and what each person needed. Just an exchange of information, no commitments, no obligations, just a conversation between people who were all trying to solve the same basic problems with different pieces of the puzzle. And he said this pleasantly and with the easy confidence of someone who genuinely believed that most disagreements were just misunderstandings about value. And he pulled out a small notebook and suggested they go around the group and each person say one thing they had in surplus and one thing they currently lacked. Just information, just the basic shape of the situation. And nobody had to commit to anything or disclose anything they weren't comfortable disclosing. And it was a simple enough suggestion that refusing it would have felt petty. And so the group did it, haltingly and with varying degrees of specificity. And by the time they had gone around once, there was something slightly different in the air. Not warmed exactly, but the first faint outline of a shared picture. And Milo thought that was a fine place to build from. And the temperature in the group dropped a few degrees in a helpful direction. June was the one who actually moved the conversation forward, which was not something she had planned to do, but happened the way most useful things happen, which was because the alternative was watching everyone stand around being stubborn while a real problem went unaddressed. And the real problem, as June saw, was that they were all focused on the social architecture of the group, when the physical architecture, their survival, was the thing that actually needed immediate attention. And so she opened her notebook to the soil analysis she had conducted on her property and the surrounding area and started talking about what the data showed, talking in the direct, practical way she always talked when she had information she thought people needed. And what she said was that surface agriculture was going to be impossible for at least another year based on soil condition and light levels, that the underground growing capacity she had established was currently producing enough calories to sustain approximately 1.5 people on a maintenance diet, and that if they were serious about long-term survival rather than just extended dying, they needed to be thinking right now about how to pool growing resources and knowledge across multiple locations, because no single bunker operation was going to be sufficient on its own. And she said all of this looking at her notebook rather than at the group, because June did not need an audience to make a point. She just needed the point to land. And she could tell from the quality of the silence that followed that it had landed, that everyone present was doing the same mental arithmetic she had already done and arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. Owen presented his atmospheric data next, spreading his printed charts on Milo's folding table with the methodical care of someone who had prepared this presentation many times in his head and was finally getting to deliver it. And he walked through the numbers with a precision and relative emotional flatness that characterized everything Owen did, explaining the dust saturation models and the temperature depression projections, and the radiation baseline readings and the estimated timeline for surface conditions to improve to the point where limited outdoor activity without full respiratory protection became viable. And he said the number that everyone had been privately calculating, but nobody had said out loud yet, which was that based on current atmospheric modeling, the underground phase of survival was going to last a minimum of 14 months, and potentially as long as 22, and that any planning that did not account for that timeline was planning built on wishful thinking rather than data. And he said this without apology, because Owen did not apologize for data. Data was not something you apologize for. Data was just what was true. And if what was true was difficult, then the only productive response was to incorporate it into your planning and move forward. And he looked around the group after he said it with the slightly anxious expression of a person who knows they have just said something that people needed to hear, but did not want to, watching to, see whether the response was going to be productive engagement or defensive denial. because Owen had seen both reactions many times in professional life and knew which one led somewhere useful and which one led to a lot of wasted time and emotional energy that nobody here could afford to spend. And he waited, and the group was quiet, and the quiet had the quality of people doing hard arithmetic. Walt spoke last and spoke briefly, which was his habit, and what he said was that he wanted to point out something he had been observing for the past 4 hours, which was that every single person standing at this crossroads had a piece of the answer, that Grady was right that they needed structure, and Rex was right that the structure had to respect individual sovereignty, and June was right that food production was a central problem, and Owen was right that the timeline was longer than most. People were comfortable accepting, and Milo was right that exchange and fair value were going to be the mechanism that made cooperation possible, and that none of these things contradicted each other, even though everyone had been treating them like they did. And he said that what he'd learned from 40 years on the radio was that people who seemed like they were disagreeing were usually just describing the same thing from different angles, and that the skill was not in winning the argument, but in finding the angle that let everyone's piece fit. And he stopped talking and let that sit, and the late afternoon light, what little of it filtered through the pale sky, was beginning to fade, and nobody had made any agreements, and nobody had signed anything, and no decisions had been formally reached. And in another context that might have looked like failure, but Walt had run enough nets and mediated enough disputes over 40 years of radio operation to know that the first meeting was never about decisions. It was about whether people would show up at all and whether they would stay long enough to hear each other. And by both of those measures today had been something closer to a beginning than it looked, and nobody responded immediately to what he had said. And in the silence, Rex shifted his weight slightly and looked at the ground, and then looked back up, and Walt caught that movement in his peripheral vision and filed away without comment, because Walt knew the difference between a person who was unconvinced and a person who was thinking, and Rex was thinking, and that was enough for one day. The crisis started with Owen, which was ironic given that Owen was the one who had been most carefully tracking the variables that should have prevented it. But the thing about data is that it tells you what has happened and models what might happen, and cannot fully account for the specific way that a human body will respond to months of underground living, reduced caloric intake, recycled air, minimal natural light, and a particular psychological weight of knowing that the world above has been fundamentally destroyed. And Owen had been monitoring his own vitals the same way he monitored everything else, logging his blood pressure and resting heart rate and sleep quality and caloric intake with the same precision he applied to his atmospheric readings. And the numbers had been drifting in a direction he did not like for about 3 weeks before his body made the decision for him. And the drifting had been gradual enough that he had told himself each morning that today's reading was an outlier that the trend would correct, that the body was adaptable, and his was no exception, which was a kind of motivated reasoning that Owen would have identified immediately in anyone else, but managed to overlook entirely in himself, because he did not want the numbers to mean what they were starting to mean. And then he woke up on a Tuesday morning 61 days after the first crossroads meeting, unable to stand without the room tilting sideways, his heart running at a rate, and with an irregularity that he recognized immediately as something that required intervention he could not provide for himself. And he lay back on his cot and looked at the ceiling of his bunker for a long moment, running through his options with the methodical clarity that he maintained even when the subject of the analysis was his own potential death. And what he arrived at was that he needed medical supplies he did not have, specifically a particular cardiac medication he had included in his original prep list, but had been unable to source before the impact, and that the only person in the network who had mentioned having an extensive medical stockpile was Rex, who had listed it briefly and without detail during the Crossroads inventory exchange, and who had not been heard from on the radio in 11 days. Walt was the one Owen called first, because Walt was always the first call, and Walt heard the particular quality of Owen's voice and asked only 2 questions before reaching for his transmission key. And the first question was, "What do you need?" And the second question was, "How much time do you have?" And Owen answered both with the same flat precision he used for everything, and Walt wrote the answers in his logbook. and then began working the frequencies with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that efficiency was now a medical variable, reaching Grady first because Grady monitored his radio on a fixed schedule, and Walt knew exactly when he would be listening, and Grady's response was immediate and practical, running through his own medical inventory in real time over the air, confirming that he had some of what Owen needed but not all of it, and then asking the question that everyone was already thinking, which was whether anyone had been able to reach Rex lately, and the silence on the frequency after that question was its own kind of answer. June had been trying to reach Rex for 9 days, not because of any emergency, but because she had a question about water filtration systems, and Rex's setup was reputedly the most sophisticated in the group, and she had transmitted on his known frequency every morning for a week without response, and had eventually mentioned it to Walt in passing. And Walt had said he was aware and was monitoring the situation, which was Walt's way of saying he was worried but did not want to create alarm. And now, June sat in her grow room with her radio in her hand, listening to the conversation between Walt and Grady, and feeling something cold settle in her chest that was not quite fear, but was close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter much. Because Rex going silent was one thing, but Rex going silent, right when someone needed what he had, was the kind of coincidence that did not feel like coincidence. And she keyed her transmission and said she would go, that her property was the closest to Rex's approximate location based on the coordinates Walt had once triangulated from his signal, and Grady immediately said absolutely not, that a solo approach to an unknown situation was tactically unsound, and June said she was not asking for his tactical assessment, and Milo said over the air that he could meet June at a midpoint and they could approach together, and there was a brief silence, and then Grady said he was coming too, and the channel went quiet while everyone calculated travel times in their heads, and Owen listened to all of it from his cot with his hand on his own pulse, counting beats and noting irregularities, and thinking that whatever happened next was going to tell them more about who they actually were to each other than 4 hours at Crossroads ever could. Milo reached June's position first, and they traveled the remaining distance to Rex's approximate location together, moving through the gray landscape with the careful attention of people who had learned to read in unfamiliar terrain. And Milo had brought trade goods out of habit and found himself feeling slightly foolish about it, and then decided he wasn't foolish at all, because if Rex was fine and just being Rex, then an offer of something valuable was the most likely thing to get his door open. And June had brought her soil kit also out of habit and felt no foolishness about it whatsoever, because her soil kit went everywhere with her now, and that was simply who she was. And they found Rex's bunker entrance not because Rex had told anyone where it was, but because Walt had spent weeks doing passive signal analysis and had narrowed the location to a half-mile radius, and June had walked that radius twice in the past week looking at the terrain the way a person who had spent years thinking about where she would put a bunker entrance thought about terrain, and when she found it, she recognized it immediately, a flat metal hatch set into a hillside with a kind of careful concealment that spoke of years of intentional work. And she crouched next to it and knocked 3 times and said his name and waited, and nothing happened, and she knocked again and said that Owen was sick and needed medication, and that she was not leaving until she heard from him, and the silence stretched long enough that Milo put his hand on her shoulder, and she shrugged it off gently and knocked a 3rd time. And then she stopped knocking and just sat down cross-legged in front of the hatch the way you sit when you have decided that comfort matters more than dignity and you are prepared to be there for a long time. And she did not say anything else because she had already said what needed saying, and repeating it would have been pressure, and June had made a decision on the walk over that she was not going to pressure Rex into anything, that she was going to give him the information and the space and let him make his own choice, because that was the only kind of choice that meant anything. And she sat in the gray afternoon quiet with the ash-covered ground under her and the pale sky above her and waited, and Milo stood a few feet back and watched her with an expression she couldn't see and wouldn't have been able to read anyway, and the silence stretched to 5 minutes and then to 10, and then there was the sound of a bolt being drawn back from the inside. Grady arrived 20 minutes after the hatch opened, having pushed himself harder than his knee appreciated across unfamiliar terrain. And he found June and Rex sitting outside the bunker entrance on a flat piece of ground with Rex's medical inventory spread between them, and June working through it with the focused attention of someone who knew what she was looking for, and Rex was watching her do it with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not comfortable exactly, but not hostile either. More like a man who had made a decision he had not entirely processed yet, and was waiting to see how it felt. And what Grady noticed, after he noticed the medical supplies and noted June's competence in sorting through them, was that Rex looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the particular tiredness of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just, in the last few minutes, set a small piece of it down. And Grady recognized that look because he had seen it in people coming off long deployments. The look of a person whose vigilance had been wound so tight for so long that even a single moment of lowering it felt like a physical change in the body, and he felt something that was not quite sympathy but was in the same neighborhood. And Grady stopped at a distance and looked at the scene and made the deliberate choice not to say anything about protocol or approach or the fact that June had come out here without waiting for him, because Grady was a man who understood situations, and this situation was clearly in a phase that did not require his management. And instead, he just walked over and looked at the medical supplies and asked Rex directly if he had the specific medication Owen needed. And Rex looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the supplies and said yes, he had it. He had 2 courses of it. And he picked up the blister pack and held it out, and Grady took it. And the exchange was so simple and so quick that it almost didn't seem like the thing it was, which was Rex making a choice in about 3 seconds at his entire survival. Philosophy had argued against for 11 years. Walt coordinated the relay from his radio, talking Grady through the fastest route to Owen's position, and talking Owen through the waiting, which was a harder job by far, because Grady at least had movement and purpose, and Owen had only his own pulse to count and his own thoughts to manage. And Walt kept his voice steady and unhurried the way he kept his voice in every situation, because Walt had learned long ago that panic was contagious, and so was calm, and he had made his choice about which. One he was going to spread, and Owen lay on his cot and listened to Walt's voice on the radio and thought about the data he had been collecting for the past 2 months, all the careful numbers and projections and timelines, and thought that there was a variable he had not adequately accounted for in any of his modeling, which was a specific way that being in genuine danger clarified the things that mattered and simplified the things that felt complicated. And he thought that when he was back on his feet, he was going to revise his recovery projections to include a social cohesion metric, because what happened today was not just a medical intervention. It was a data point about what this group was capable of when the problem was real and the need was immediate, and that data point was worth more than he knew how to quantify yet. But he was going to try. Owen was back on his feet in 6 days, which was faster than he had projected and slower than he had wanted. And the first thing he did when he was steady enough to sit at his desk was update his logbook with everything that had happened, not just the medical details, but the sequence of events, who had done what and when and how long each step had taken. Because Owen documented everything, and this was not nothing. This was in fact the most significant event, since the impact itself in terms of what it revealed about the group's functional capacity. And when he was done writing, he sat with the logbook open in front of him and read back through it twice, and then closed it and reached for his radio and asked Walt to call a second meeting, not at the crossroads this time, but somewhere more central, somewhere that acknowledged without anyone having to say it directly that the geography of the group had shifted since the last time they had all been in the same place, because Rex's location was no longer a secret, and that fact had changed the map in ways that needed to be acknowledged and built upon rather than politely ignored. Rex agreed to host, which surprised everyone and surprised Rex somewhat as well if he was being honest with himself. And he spent 2 days after medication exchange sitting with a decision he had made and examining it from every angle the way he examined every significant decision, looking for flaw in his reasoning, the place where emotion had overridden judgment. And what he kept finding instead was that the reasoning held, that what happened with Owen had not been a breach of his principles, but a clarification of them, because Rex's foundational principle had always been survival, not isolation, and isolation had been the method he had chosen in service of survival, and the Owen situation had demonstrated in concrete terms that isolation had a ceiling, that there were failure modes a single person could not address alone no matter how well prepared they were. And Rex was not a man who ignored data simply because he found the implications inconvenient, and so he had transmitted on the group frequency on a Thursday morning and said they could meet at his location, and given the coordinates with the flat directness of a man who had made up his mind and saw no value in ceremony around it. And Walt had acknowledged the transmission without comment because Walt understood that the right response to Rex giving his coordinates for the first time was not gratitude or enthusiasm, but simple professional acknowledgement. And that was exactly what Rex needed it to be. The second meeting had a different quality from the first, something in the air that was not quite warmth, but was a thing that comes before warmth. A careful mutual respect between people who had been through something together and were still figuring out what it meant. And they gathered outside Rex's bunker entrance in the flat gray light of a late afternoon with the ash-colored hills behind them and Milo's folding table set up again, but this time with things on it that people had brought, for each other rather than for trade. June's dried herbs and Owen's printed atmospheric charts and Grady's hand-drawn regional map and a thermos of actual hot coffee from Milo that nobody asked the origin of but everybody accepted. And there was a moment before anyone spoke where they all just stood there in the quiet of the ruined landscape and looked at each other and at the table between them and at the bunker entrance behind Rex. And the moment lasted only a few seconds, but it had a weight to it, the weight of people who had each spent months alone underground, and then months more circling each other at a careful distance, finally being close enough to see the fatigue and the determination in each other's faces, and recognizing both. And Rex stood slightly apart the way he always stood, but slightly less apart than he had at the crossroads. And the distance felt chosen rather than defensive, like a man who preferred the edge of the room, but was no longer afraid of what was in the middle of it. Grady spoke first this time without proposing anything, which for Grady was the equivalent of a significant personal development. And what he said was that he owed the group an acknowledgement, that his approach at the first meeting had been about imposing a structure he had already designed rather than building one with the people who would have to live inside it, and that he understood now that those were fundamentally different things and that the difference mattered, and he said it in the straightforward, undecorated way of a man who did not do apologies often but did them properly when he did them, looking at each person in the group as he spoke and not looking away. And when he was done, he looked at Rex specifically and said that he understood better now why the first proposal had felt like a threat rather than an offer. And Rex nodded once, a small acknowledgement that cost him nothing and meant more than Grady had expected it to. And then Grady said that he still believed they needed structure, but that he wanted to hear what structure meant to each person before he said another word about what it should look like. And he sat down on a flat rock and crossed his arms and waited. And it was the most useful thing Grady had done since the first meeting. What followed was 3 hours of conversation that was nothing like the first meeting, not because there was no disagreement, but because the disagreement had a different texture now, the texture of people who were arguing towards something rather than away from each other. And they built the framework piece by piece the way you build something that has to actually hold weight, testing each element before moving to the next. And there were moments where voices rose and moments where someone said something that landed wrong and had to be walked back and rephrased. And there were long pauses where people looked at the ground and thought before speaking. And all of that was fine. All of that was a friction of real building rather than the performance of agreement. And Milo proposed the exchange system he had been refining in his logbook for months, a simple ledger of contributions and needs with no fixed currency, but a shared understanding of fair value, enforced by nothing more than reputation, and the knowledge that in a community, the smaller your reputation was everything you had. And Grady pushed back on 2 specifics and accepted the rest. And June proposed the agricultural cooperative she had been designing since day 30 underground, a rotating system of shared labor and shared yield that would allow each person contribute what they were able to and receive what they needed. And Owen provided the data that showed exactly why the cooperative model was not idealistic, but mathematically necessary given the caloric requirements of the group over the next 14 months, and Rex listened to all of it from his flat rock on the edge of the gathering and said nothing for a long time, and then said that he was willing to participate in the agricultural cooperative on the condition that participation did not require disclosure of his full inventory, that he would contribute labor and specific agreed-upon resources, and that was a boundary. And June said that was fine, that the cooperative was about what people put in, not what they kept back. And Rex looked at her for a moment, and then nodded again, and that was how Rex joined something for the first time in 11 years. Walt formalized the communication network that afternoon, which in practical terms meant writing down what had already been happening informally, and giving it enough structure to be reliable without so much structure that it felt like surveillance. And he assigned each person a check-in window, and a backup frequency, and a protocol for emergency transmissions. And he explained it clearly and briefly and asked if anyone had objections, and nobody did, and he added a provision that any new signal detected on monitored frequencies would be shared with the group within 24 hours, because Walt had been thinking about the edges of the map, about the fact that their 6-person network was almost certainly not the full picture of who had survived, and that the question of how they responded to new contacts was going to matter as much as how they had learned to respond to each other. And Rex asked one technical question about antenna security that Walt answered in detail, and the exchange had a comfortable rhythm of two people who spoke the same language. And Walt thought that he had known from the first time he detected Rex's passive signal presence that Rex was a serious operator, and it was satisfying, a quiet way to be proven right about that, to find that the person behind the ghost signal was exactly the kind of person Walt had hoped he might be. The afternoon light was failing by the time they had worked through the main points of what they were building, and nobody had called it anything, had not given a name or declared a community, or made any speeches about what it represented, because they were all practical people who had survived by being practical, and the practical thing was to do the work, and let the work be what it was. And they sat in the fading gray light with a framework of something fragile and functional between them. And Milo poured the last of the coffee and handed the cups around, and there was a moment where they all just held their cups and nobody said anything. And the silence was not the dense, pressurized silence of the weeks after the impact or the careful, guarded silence of the first Crossroads meeting, but something different, something that had room in it. And June broke it by saying she had seeds she wanted to show Rex before they left. Seeds she had been cultivating underground that she thought would do well in his soil conditions based on elevation and the aspect of his hillside, and Rex said he would take a look, and Grady asked Owen if the 14-month timeline had any flexibility built into it, and Owen said yes, there were optimistic and pessimistic bands, and Grady said, "Tell me about the optimistic band," and Owen almost smiled, and that was how it started, not with a declaration, or a ceremony, or a moment that anyone would have recognized as historic from the outside, but with a woman holding out a paper envelope of seeds to a man who had spent 11 years making sure nobody could find him, and the man taking them, and the two of them walking over to look at the ground together in the gray and quiet afternoon of a world that was broken but not finished, diminished but not done. And somewhere in the distance, Walt's antenna caught a fragment of a new signal on a frequency nobody had used before, faint and irregular, the unmistakable pattern of someone else finding their way to a radio for the first time, someone else deciding that silence had cost them enough, and Walt reached for his logbook and wrote down the frequency and the time, because that was what you did, and because the work was not over, and because the map was always bigger than you thought it was.